So a few months ago, HalfBreadChaos made a video talking about the cliffs in Deltarune. I found this video very interesting, because I've had many questions about this mysterious area myself. In the past, most theories relied heavily on speculation, since we didn't have much information to go off of. With Chapter 2's release, we've finally been able to answer a lot of big questions we've been asking since 2018. We also have more questions than ever before now, but that's not the point here. The point is, a lot of questions can now be answered with this new chapter. And while a lot has already been answered, there's one mystery in particular which I don't see many people talking about. I'm of course talking about the cliffs. This brings me back to the video made by HalfBreadChaos. I don't want to repeat their entire video, so definitely watch it before continuing, but here's a brief recap. The cliffs is the first ever location in the dark world that we get to see. We enter via the school supply closet. Important to note that unlike other dark worlds, this one hasn't completely transformed its light world counterpart. A common mistake is stating that Chapter 1's dark world takes place in the supply closet, when it really takes place in the abandoned classroom. The supply closet correlates with Castle Town. I'll talk more about this later, but this is still recap time. As I just said, the supply closet doesn't seem to have completely transformed into a dark world upon entering. As Susie says, its walls are gone, but it still clearly has a floor, and a few pieces of paper scattered around. It's only when the door slams shut that the floor collapses, which is an important detail that HalfBreadChaos didn't really touch upon. After falling, we are greeted to the audio file ocean.ogg playing, before taking us to the cliffs. The place seems abandoned, almost like a wasteland. An area which seems to perfectly fit the description of the roaring, the apocalyptic event Ralsei describes at the end of Chapter 2. One of the three titans in that cutscene has the same eye markings that appear in the cliffs, backing this point up further. Aside from that, there are four more interesting details in this area. The glow's hard item, the strange black liquid leaking out of the walls, the piles of dust, and the weird creatures firing pellets at the player. The cliffs link up directly to Castle Town. I also found it interesting how Castle Town leads directly to the Fields of Hopes and Dreams, but not to Cyber World. The Great Door seems to suggest a connection between Castle Town and the Dark World in Chapter 1. Now this could mean that Chapter 1's Dark World has existed for much longer than we think, unlike the Dark World in Chapter 2. But keep in mind that we never actually see the library's computer lab in Chapter 1. All we know is that Toby was in there, which could be a subtle way of saying that a Dark World already existed in there. If so, then Chapter 3 will truly be the first time we see a newly created Dark World. Regardless, another interesting detail are the Dark World basements. So far, each Dark World has had a secret basement area which contains its secret boss battle. What's fascinating about Jevils in particular, is the fact that it uses the same torches as the ones in Castle Town, not the ones used in Card Castle. This suggests a stronger connection between the cliffs and the Dark World basements than we may have thought. HalfBreadChaos also theorizes about who could be the one shutting the closet door behind Chris and Susie. The obvious answer is the knight, but that seems too obvious. Sense is another possibility, for which there's a lot of evidence HalfBreadChaos mentions. Another candidate is Jerson, but personally, I'm less inclined to believe that. Anyway, that's enough recapping. From this point on, I'm assuming you've watched HalfBreadChaos's video, so let's move on to my theories. Before anything else, I quickly want to bring up a point HalfBreadChaos made about the audiophile Wolfenstein. This is the audio file that plays in Undertale when Frisk approaches the strange curtain tentacle in the True Lab. HalfBreadChaos said it sounded similar to Bonatrus, and therefore could be related to Papyrus. As someone who knows way too much about Toby's sound design, I can confirm Bonatrus has nothing to do with this audio file. Wolfenstein is actually a citrus preset from the Ultimate Citrus Pack, the same pack which includes the citrus presets used in Your Best Nightmare. This also feels like a good moment to mention that I'm not trying to disprove HalfBreadChaos's points or anything like that. The point of this video is to build on top of theirs, not debunk it. The next thing is the music track that plays in the cliffs. Since Toby loves to hide so much stuff in his music, it's only natural to assume some kind of bigger meaning is hidden here. So, considering how much time I spend recreating Toby's music, I got to work. I replicated the secret of Evermore strings almost instantly. Other than that, there's really not much aside from some wind. I really tried to find the sample, but couldn't find it. Naturally I assumed it was SGM wind, but I just couldn't get it to sound right. I tried detuning it, but it also didn't sound right. I even searched through the SFX drum kit, but still came out empty-handed. Eventually I thought it might be Ocean.ogg slowed down, but even that didn't work. After that, I just gave up. Considering it's just wind, I highly doubt there's much hidden in the sound itself. The important part is the actual notes played by the strings. Once again, I tried speeding them up, I tried slowing them down, but couldn't find any leitmotif that sounded similar. Not even the fandom page found anything. So as it turns out, this track really might not have anything after all. As it turns out, none of the music tracks whose file name starts with creepy seem to have any leitmotifs. The only one that does is the track The Door, whose leitmotif appears in the world revolving, but I don't think that means much. So the soundtrack doesn't have much to cover, but I still haven't talked about Ocean.ogg. The thing is, I don't really have much to say about it. It's only 6 seconds long, and doesn't have any visuals accompanying it in-game. What is interesting is how similar the scene in which it's used in, is to Frisk's fall in Waterfall. If this similarity isn't a coincidence, which I highly doubt it is, then this means that Ocean.ogg is most likely used to represent a flashback. In Undertale, the fall is what triggered this flashback, so the same should be true here. If all of this is true, that means that Chris suffered some kind of incident which involved an ocean, and a fall. Maybe he fell into that ocean? Is that the reason there are so many references to water throughout the Dark World? We really can't be sure until further chapters. That about covers everything I had to say about audio files. So in conclusion, not much. But hey, maybe the lack of audio is an even bigger detail. So we can finally talk about the cliffs themselves. Where do we start? Well, let's start with the strange black liquid that only appears here. So far, the biggest guesses we have are either oil, ink, or black paint. Ink would match up with the ocean theme, but realistically, none of these three options make much sense when considering that this place is supposed to be a school supply closet. Well, here are my thoughts. Something I rarely see mentioned are the holes from which this strange liquid is pouring out of. They resemble faces. What's even stranger is the fact that some appear to be smiling, but I don't know if that's important. Our brains are designed to make faces out of basically everything, but I highly doubt these were a coincidence. After all, even some of the eye markings are leaking this black liquid, almost like they were crying. So if these holes are supposed to resemble faces, maybe this black stuff is supposed to be blood? After all, blood resembles the color black a lot more than it's often depicted in media. It's also important to remember that we have never seen a monster bleed before, so the color could very likely be black. I'm also not counting Sans, because he could have easily faked it with a ketchup bottle, which is even more possible when remembering that he's a skeleton. So if this black liquid is actually monster blood, or at the very least meant to represent monster blood, does that make this area a sort of graveyard for monsters? Almost like a catacomb? I don't see why it couldn't. In that case, could this area be connected to the graveyard in Hometown? Personally, I think that's spitballing a little too much, but maybe someone else can find a connection there. Then there are those weird wobbly things that wave at Chris as he walks past. I really had no clue what they were supposed to be, so I decided to check what their sprites are called, and I can't believe what I found. Well, you know how HalfBreadChaos referred to them as wobbly things? Well, that's exactly what their sprites are called. So not even Toby knows what exactly these things should be called. Either that, or he deliberately didn't name them anything descriptive, because he knew people like me would check there. Regardless of what they are, the save point calls their bullets spores, so that's our big hint. We can limit our search down to whatever can create spores. Spores are produced by bacteria, fungi, algae, and plants, which still doesn't narrow it down a lot. But once again, we can change that. We haven't considered what type of spore these are. All we know about them is that they damage Chris, which could be considered completely irrelevant since technically anything can, but we have to narrow our search somehow, so I'm going with it. After doing some research, I couldn't find anything that brings us to the answer. Personally, I don't know if there is one. If any plant experts are watching this, maybe you know of a specific bacteria, fungi, algae, or plant that resembles these things. If so, please do share. For the time being, I got nothing. If they're algae, that could be another link to the ocean theme. Then again, they could also be moss. Wait, no, we already know what moss looks like in the dark world. Lastly, there are these strange piles of dust. Now at first, just like many others, I thought these were piles of chalk dust. They could very much still be chalk dust, but the game sprites are called dust pile, so we can't be certain. They move almost like they're alive and breathing. When interacted with, they pop and play an audio file simply titled cough. It's unclear if it's Susie who's coughing, or the dust piles themselves, but considering they play this sound effect even when Susie isn't hiding in them, I'm inclined to believe they make the sound themselves. Unless, Chris is the one coughing. But I won't go there. Once again, I don't have much to add. I still think these things are piles of chalk dust. The dark world brings almost everything to life, so maybe that's why they're pulsing like this. The basements have a very clear connection to the cliffs, or at the very least, to Castle Town. It's yet to be fully explained what exactly Castle Town is, or more specifically, where. So far, it's depicted as a sort of hub world for darkness. A dark world in which all darkness can peacefully live without turning into stone. But why are the basements connected to Castle Town? Well, according to HalfBreadChaos's theory, each dark world's castle is the big cabinet in their light world equivalent room. The basement to those castles would then be the space beneath these cabinets. Because of this, HalfBreadChaos suggested Spamton's Neo body to actually be a toy or drawing a student may have lost. Personally, I think it's a bit more complicated than that. Keep in mind that Swatch very much knows about this Neo body. When asked about the basement, at first he claims there is none. This could be taken as a hint that these basements don't exist in these dark worlds, but Swatch disproves this in this very dialogue. He very clearly lies about there being no basement. He also tries changing the subject as fast as possible, mentioning that we need to relax, and that we are bothering the other customers. Bothering them with what? By mentioning the one part of the mansion which requires a keygen to access. The darkness in this dark world clearly sealed the basement off. But wouldn't that go against the theory that basements are actually part of Castletown? Well, yes and no. Jevils' basement is most certainly connected to Castletown, the torches prove it. The cliffs are also referred to as a bunch of question marks, just like Jevils' basement. But the mansion basement doesn't have those candles. In fact, it doesn't resemble Castletown at all. So maybe Jevils' basement is connected to Castletown, and this one isn't. But why? Why would only certain basements be connected to Castletown? Jevil might have something to do with that, but I'm not sure. Let's get back to the Neo body. The only description we get is from Swatch. The embodiment of a Lightner's dream which he helped create. Splashing color from the motion of their hand certainly sounds like a child drawing, but keep in mind that Swatch helped create it. So unless Swatch is supposed to be an eraser or pencil sharpener in the light world, I don't think it's a drawing. So if that's true, is the basement even the space underneath the cabinet? For all we know, the mansion could actually be the closet instead of the cabinet. But for now, let's get back to Jevil. What's interesting about his cell is that, unlike the mansion basement, nobody seems to know about it. No darkness ever mentions Jevil, or the cell he's locked up in. Card Castle already has a dungeon, Jevil's cell is hidden. The only Darner who knows about him is Chong, who much like Jevil, doesn't seem to be directly inside the dark world, but outside it looking inside. His shop is sewn into the darkness, suggesting that much like Jevil, he is in fact outside. All this mention of the outside leads me to believe that these strange areas are in fact outside of the abandoned classroom. Castletown definitely is, since it's in the supply closet. But what about Jevil's cell? Am I saying there's a hole underneath the cabinet? It's possible, but seems a little far-fetched. But I think we've skipped over the most important detail of all. Something I briefly mentioned at the start, which could possibly give us our answer about the cliffs. I'm obviously talking about the roaring. The roaring felt like it came out of nowhere. An apocalyptic event resulting in the death and destruction of every living being? Sounds pretty important. So why did nobody know about it? Ralsei seems to be the only one to know about the roaring. Jevil might also know about it, but he's Jevil, so of course he does. What I want to know is why Ralsei waited so long to tell everyone. Maybe he didn't want to remember it. But why? Well, what if he's seen it happen before? The cliffs are a perfect description of what we would expect the aftermath of a roaring to look like. Dead, empty, quiet, void of all life. This also lines up with our monster blood theory. If the roaring caused a mass genocide of darkness, maybe these giant walls really are tombs. I know the prophecy says darkness would turn to stone, but that doesn't technically disprove this. Their bodies may still be able to decompose in some way. Since we've never seen a Darner body decay before, we can't rule out the possibility. You could argue that their bodies turn to dust as soon as they die, since that's a major plot point in Undertale, but I'm still not ruling out the possibility. The eye markers which are carved into the walls are depicted on one of the three titans during Ralsei's prophecy. Maybe these carvings were left by darkness as a warning, or maybe they were left by the Titans as a sort of victory mark. But what about the part where lighters are trapped in eternal darkness? Well, the supply closet is pitch black. There's no light at all. The only light is the light that enters from the outside. Our understanding of the roaring is still incredibly vague, so I might be onto something here. If Ralsei willingly kept this information from us for this long, who knows how much he still is. He may have just told us enough to ensure we wouldn't create another. He could have left out as many details as he wanted. So what if Ralsei really did experience a roaring before? If he was the only survivor, he would definitely be traumatized. This would explain a lot of his behavior. There are a bunch of different reasons people have come up with to explain Ralsei's constant desire to let everybody walk all over him. He wants nothing more than to please Chris and Susie. Very rarely does he complain about Susie's rudeness, even going as far as to say that that's what makes her Susie-like. Explanations for Ralsei's behavior vary from him being in love with Chris, to him being a masochist, to him simply being insane, and if my theory is correct. That last option ironically doesn't sound that crazy. If Ralsei was traumatized from being the sole survivor of a roaring, one would imagine he would do absolutely anything to not be alone anymore. After all, he is the lonely prince. If not being lonely is the only thing that matters to him, then this would explain why he doesn't retaliate against Susie's rudeness. As long as he's not alone, he's happy. What would make this situation even more traumatizing for Ralsei, would be if he was the reason it happened. He tells Chris he doesn't know what Ralsei-like is, but that could be taken another way. A common coping mechanism for trauma is to block out all memories associated with the event. If Ralsei caused the roaring, not only would it explain why he avoided mentioning it for so long, but it would also explain why he hides so much about himself. He literally hides in his own shadow, hiding his face under not just a hat, but also a cloak. He knows his true self did something horrible, and therefore wants to hide it, not only from those around him, but also himself. Might be stretching it a bit with that one, but it's a thought. I always found it strange that none of the houses in Castletown were ever open. Even in Chapter 2, they don't open, but get replaced. Almost like Ralsei is rebuilding his destroyed land. The houses we see in Castletown belong to the former residents who were destroyed during the roaring. This would explain why Ralsei is the only living creature to know about the roaring. All other dark worlds were created after the roaring took place. But we can't forget about the night. They definitely know about the roaring, and are purposefully keeping it to themselves. They are called the Roaring Night, so it makes sense. In that case, maybe the night is the one who caused the roaring instead of Ralsei. In that scenario, Ralsei would have witnessed exactly what the night is capable of. This might explain why Ralsei waited specifically for Chris and Susie to arrive, knowing they are the only ones who can stop the night from repeating history. If Ralsei was so desperate to not be lonely, it wouldn't make sense for him to stay in Castletown, when the Great Door is literally a few steps away. The only reason he would wait for Chris and Susie, is if he was aware that a second roaring could occur if they didn't stop the night together. That about sums up my theory. The cliffs used to be Ralsei's dark world before being destroyed by the roaring. The black liquid is possibly the decaying bodies of the darkness who were killed. They could also be the decaying bodies of the Titans, considering we never see them in the cliffs. Honestly, the more I think about certain details, the more this theory starts to fall apart for me. But hey, just because some parts might be wrong, doesn't mean all of it is. I still think it's at least worth considering some of these details, as I really think I'm onto something here. There's still so much I want to talk about. How long has the Dark World from Chapter 1 really existed? If you think it's a fresh new Dark World, consider why that classroom was abandoned in the first place. Maybe it's because the person who created the dark world works at the school, and therefore closed the classroom after creating the fountain. But then, what would their motivations be? God, there are so many questions, my head is spinning like crazy. I think I need to lie down for a few days. The longer I keep writing this script, the longer it's gonna take to finish this video, so I'll end it here. I hope I was able to add something new to the table. I also hope you don't see me as a HalfBreadChaos clone or anything. They may have given me the idea to use text-to-speech, but I've wanted to make Undertale and Deltarune theories for a long time now. I'll be making lots of original theories in the future, not just responses. But for now, I need a cup of tea.